Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me once again is Clifford Winston, a senior fellow of economic studies at the Brookings Institution. Clifford, thank you so much for joining me. I'm really excited to talk with you today to get your perspective because I've talked a lot about Elon Musk and DOGE and how it relates to politics. Now I'm excited to get the perspective from an economist. And as we know, DOGE, with Elon Musk at the helm, was tasked with the goals to, quote, dismantle government bureaucracy, slash excess regulations, cut wasteful expenditures, and restructure federal agencies. Supporters of DOGE and Elon Musk would say that this is the change maker the government needs to cut waste, fraud, and abuse, and Elon Musk is a great outside perspective. Critics, on the other hand, would call Musk the shadow president and said that he and DOGE are recklessly cutting things with a chainsaw instead of a scalpel when it comes to necessary things that helps the government function. You wrote, DOGE is a wake-up call for economists and attorneys. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah. So, let's start from the beginning. I think there is certainly motivation for DOGE, but DOGE is not original. There have been many government programs trying to, quote, improve government efficiency. They're hardly the first one to do this. So, for decades, elected officials have been saying, yes, we need to get government more efficient. And it's clearly motivated by the vast empirical evidence of what we call government failures. So it's surely justified. But what concerns me is this is something that economists have written about. They know enough about it. But Elon Musk and the team are not drawing on what economists have to say. Now, I think one of the problems may be that economists tend to be more constructive in the sense they recommend efficient government reforms. And that's fine in theory, but the reality is policymakers just don't adopt those. And probably what they should have done, or more economists need to do, is point out private sector alternatives and say, look, okay, government has failed, as we say here, but here's a private sector approach that could be effective. And that then is what Musk should really be focusing on. Yes, it is true that government has a lot of inefficiencies. There's a lot of room for improvement. Okay. But then you got to say, okay, what is the alternative? What are we going to do? If we just get rid of services and don't even consider efficient reforms, then who knows what we're going to get? And you may wind up getting rid of things that really don't make sense to eliminate. That is the big problem.
To your point, Elon Musk and the people who are working on DOGE are hardly the first people to say, hey, we want an efficient government. We want to cut out wasteful spending. You're saying it's a good idea in theory, but in practice, it could be not doing what it needs to be done from an economist perspective. What are some of those efficient reforms that you're talking about?
So I think for each thing you want to identify, for example, if you think that an agency really isn't providing benefits, right, that would be the easiest thing. In other words, and this is what Musk relies on. He plays an old YouTube of Milton Friedman, where Friedman's interviewed and he's checking off each department. Don't need that. Don't need that. Don't need education department. Don't need the labor department. Don't need this department, whatever. And Musk interprets that as the green light to just get rid of everything. However, my point is, let's take things a little more systematically and say, okay, if we don't need the education department, why do we have it in the first place? Okay, now, that's sort of a fairly subtle argument to make. In other words, education department can be justified for two reasons. One, because education provides a positive externality, meaning that it is better for society if more people are educated, okay? And so people on either political spectrum would say, yes, if more people were better educated, we might have different political outcomes, right? So that's one reason. why you could justify having some government intervention. Okay. The other one is that we believe education is what we call a merit good. That is, regardless of whether you can afford it, this is something that all people should have. So we want education to be provided and not necessarily to people who can afford it. All right. K through 12, that kind of thing certainly occurs. All right. So then you step back and say, okay, do we still believe in these things? Is either education a merit good or a positive externality? Then you ask, okay, we don't like the way government's doing this. What is it that we want to do instead? Now, you go ahead and say, we want the private sector to do all this. We want private schools, K through 12, or charter schools. Let the colleges do all this, and we don't need to give them any money. But you got to make the case and go through carefully and thoughtfully why you want to get rid of departments. And you could go through what I'm saying, all the way down the line. And that's what is not happening. And I think that is really what's a problem, not just departments, but now also things like Social Security, Medicare, stepping back, asking, why are we providing this? What can we do as an alternative and do it better rather than just simply saying, let's get rid of all these programs?
I think that that's a really key first question of stepping back and saying, instead of just slashing things willy-nilly, saying, why did we have this in the first place? And then as an economist, let's say you're advising Elon Musk right now. Let's say you're advising DOGE. They're watching this. After they answer that question, why did we have this in the first place? Then what is the alternative? Then where do they go from there?
Alternative, right? In other words, there are two alternatives. One would be, okay, yes, we realize government's very inefficient, but we're going to pursue an efficient reform. So we're going to keep the activity within government, but we're going to do things a lot differently. Okay, here's an example. What is known as CAFE, CAFE, corporate average fuel economy requirements, are a policy that is established with the Department of Transportation and the Energy Department, right, to improve the fuel efficiency of cars. And the justification for this is to address an externality, right, air pollution. And for that matter, even gasoline consumption, fuel consumption. All right, but let's focus on air pollution, okay? So then the argument could be, those who come in and say, wait, this is an extremely inefficient policy. Right? We really should not be doing this. Because what we're doing is we're raising the price of cars. We're forcing automakers to improve their cars so they get better fuel economy. But this seems kind of crazy because if cars get better fuel economy, won't people drive more? Right. So that would be sort of an obvious critique of CAFE. Okay. So then what do you do? All right. One approach would be, okay, we will replace CAFE with an efficient government policy. Okay. And that will be the way we address pollution or trying to reduce auto emissions. Right. And that policy could be what we call a VMT tax, a vehicle miles travel tax. So you have to pay based on the amount you drive, and there'll be an emissions component, right, depending on, how polluting your car is. And they can actually measure this in real time. Right? So this would be an efficient government policy. We don't need to get rid of government. We're addressing this in an efficient way. Now, you could say, well, but they're not going to do that. So actually a VMT tax was actually included in the Biden inflation reduction legislation. And there were calls for actually tests or, trials, pilot experiments by the Department of Transportation. They didn't do any of them. So we could say, yeah, this is fine in theory, but government is just never going to implement this. Fine. Turn to the next policy and say, okay, let's let the private sector do this. And the way you can do it is encourage the adoption of electric vehicles, right? Electric vehicles are going to pollute less. Right, we can get rid of at least the CAFE component of the Department of Transportation, the people who work on that, and the energy department, people who work on that. But we got to turn to something to do it. Why not EVs? Well, what are they doing with EVs? They're making it really hard for people to get electric vehicles because they have tariffs. And they don't even allow the best companies in the world from China, in particular BYD, Build Your Dreams, to even sell cars here. So it's just a mess. I mean, this is a problem. There are options to pursue it, and they're not taking any of them.
I think you raise a really interesting point, and that point being that there are no alternatives being offered by DOGE. Instead, they're just saying, we cut X, Y, and Z, look how much we saved, but then there's no alternative, leaving people to wonder, are the lights still on at the federal government? And DOGE says it saved the federal government $115 billion and each individual taxpayer $714. It's hard to verify that number because DOGE hasn't posted all of its receipts yet, but as an economist, what are the economic impacts here of just slashing government spending by billions, is what they're saying, and then not offering any replacement in return?
Then about services are cut that are valued, right? We're filing taxes now, right? I mean, if they start cutting the IRS, and they are, and people are flipped out, they stop working, you can imagine what a mess that's going to be. Same with Social Security, same with national parks, right? At this point, you want to get rid of people who work at the National Park Service, but you're not even offering an alternative. Okay, we're going to privatize the national parks. We're going to have a private firm come in, and they're going to run it. Great. So at least the parks will be open, there'll be service, so on and so forth. They're not even doing that. They're just getting rid of park rangers. Well, what happens when you show up? Are the parks going to be open? If there are emergencies, you're going to be able to get help, all sorts of things. And there's your problem, is some of these are valuable services. It doesn't mean the government has to provide them. You can get a private sector alternative to do it. But you can't just say, we're just not going to provide it without some explanation that there's absolutely no benefits from having this provided by either the public sector or more efficiently by the private sector. That's what I'm concerned about.
I spoke with one of the science and healthcare editors here at Forbes about some of the unintended consequences when it comes to DOGE, and he was telling me that they cut off USAID funding, and then in turn, that really impacts science here and health here in America. As a microeconomist, what are some of the unintended consequences you're seeing from DOGE and from all of these cuts?
The way to think about this is step back and say, what are we trying to do in the first place? All right. So really, what was AID about? So one of the goals that government has in terms of what we think is a social goal is to make the world safe for democracy. Right. That's not what we call a market failure. This is something beyond the markets. Markets can be efficient, but we have things that we want government to accomplish, and we determine these things in the democratic process. Okay. Reducing poverty, providing what I said, merit goods, but also, security, defense, all these kinds of things. So AID was thought of as soft power. Right? We're going to try to give money to these poor nations, but have them feel good about us, not support terrorism, do things to work with us. Okay. So if you could come over and say, well, we don't see any reason to do this. Well, fine, but make the case for it. Has AID been helpful to improve America's security in the world? Okay. I'm not sure how people can show that, but I've not seen that. All right. Then you go and say, what can we do better? All right. There's no doubt corruption, inefficiency, and these kinds of things. So we can look at some of the money we're funneling to various countries, make sure it's going to people who are doing constructive things, improving the health of their population, providing jobs, so on and so forth. But if we don't do any of that kind of stuff, and it was helpful, and we let someone else come in and start having an influence like Russia and China and these countries, they're not going to be on, quote, our side in trying to preserve democracy, right? And that's something that, we did not anticipate. If we just cut things out, then a fundamental goal is ignored and obviously can have disastrous consequences. I think the concern of your colleague is that the growth of America and the economy is spurred by innovation and technological advance. Now, DOGE might think, look, we want to restrict a lot of activities from foreign people, foreign companies, what have you, but they're not thinking about the unanticipated consequences of this is a lot of our source of innovation and technological advance. And right now they're, basically threatening people or scaring them to come to our universities. And China is trying to take advantage of this and say, here, come be a student here, do your PhD here, come work here, contribute to our innovation and technological advance. We will not be hostile toward you. I mean, the consequences of losing our technological edge to any country are huge. But that is exactly the kind of thing that could happen if we're not, seriously thinking through what we're trying to do here.
Today marks 2 months since President Trump was sworn in, since he began his second term. And I think it's impossible to talk about these 2 months without talking about DOGE, without talking about Elon Musk. And as I said earlier, in all of my conversations, people have varying opinions. Everything from let him bake, let him do his thing, he's a genius, to Elon Musk is really the shadow president, and all of this willy-nilly cutting is really detrimental to Americans, to people's jobs, to a wide host of different things, to the world and to democracy as a whole. From your vantage point as an economist, what do you think is missing then from this real national dialogue when it comes to Elon Musk and when it comes to DOGE?
I think what are we trying to do? I think we need to just really focus on what are we trying to accomplish as opposed to this cult worship and just saying no matter what he does, it's good, right? If he's trying to do something good for America, then he cannot break the law, right? It's this kind of cult worship that's getting us into a lot of trouble and preventing us from having a lot of serious dialogue, right? So we need to sort of say, what are our objectives? What are the right tools to use them? It's certainly true that government need not be the right tool, but let's discuss and identify the alternative. And this pretty much goes down to everything that they're doing, as opposed to just saying, we know what we want to do. We want to cut government. And that, quote, is what we're trying to do. Reduce the number of people working in the government. But if you don't focus on policies instead of people, then you're losing the target. And you may be cutting out things that you want. But more importantly, you may not even focus on an objective of even allowing the private sector to accomplish the goal. So that's what's being lost here. It's just too much cult worship. And then, of course, obviously, on the ideological divide that's really hurting the dialogue.
When you're looking at this idea of cutting federal spending, how big of a disconnect do you think there is between policymakers and economists?
Huge.
And then how do
huge. As far as I know, they don't even listen to us.
So how do you bridge that divide? How do we bridge that gap there?
That's an interesting question. Alan Blinder gave a speech in D.C. about the divide between economists and policymakers. And he initially said, sort of ironic, that, well, the one area where policymakers listened to us, and Blinder was a member of the Federal Reserve, was vice president of the Fed, said it's in monetary policy, right? That's what he said. There are economists there, and some of them have been chair and certainly vice chair. But this is one now that Trump even wants to take over. He wants to eliminate, for that matter, any kind of expertise. And he says, oh, no, I understand interest rates better than Powell, and I want to do that. So that's the one thing for sure that economists have historically had influence in. But other policies, look at congestion pricing. So this is my area of specialization, where economists for centuries, or at least a century, have advocated, let's go ahead and do congestion pricing. Implement it in New York City. We're all excited. This is going to be the experiment about something we've recommended for years, and finally, it's being adopted. Well, what's happening? Trump wants to basically end the experiment. And I think the problem is one of dialogue, but I talked with you last time, and I said I thought these people are crazy. And what I mean by that, and obviously there was a lot of reaction to that, is they're crazy in the sense of delusional and unwilling to try to shape arguments and policy disagreements in terms of what theory says, what evidence says, in terms of prospective evidence before that, and what retrospective evidence says. But I can't imagine having a dialogue with any of these people where I can use that framework without in the middle being, called a loser or something else. That's where our problem is we just cannot do things that really are aligned with generally rational intellectual thinking.
Well, the good news is I certainly won't call you a loser, and I appreciate our conversations always. I appreciate your perspective. Clifford Winston, thank you so much for joining me. You are welcome back anytime.